A cold breeze swept through the cemetery as the sky turned a soft shade of gray. Leaves rustled quietly, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. A young girl, no older than 10, knelt before a simple gravestone, her tiny hands clutching a single, slightly wilted rose. Her name was Lily. She had been coming here every week since her mother passed away, but today felt different. The weight of loneliness pressed harder on her little shoulders. With teary eyes, she traced the name on the stone with her fingers and whispered, "I miss you, Mama." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness of the cemetery it echoed. The words trembled as they left her lips, carrying all the sadness her heart held. She tightened her grip on the rose, the last one she had. It was the only flower she could afford, but with the few coins she had saved from helping an elderly neighbor. To anyone else, it was just a small flower, but to Lily, it was everything. It was her way of showing her mother she hadn't been forgotten. Tears streamed down her face as she placed the rose on the grave. She didn't want to leave, but she had to. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her worn-out sweater and stood up slowly. As she turned, her gaze landed on a man sitting on a nearby bench. He looked lost in thought, his face weary, as if carrying a burden no one could see. His clothes, though not tattered, were far from new. He had the look of someone who had once known better days, but had since fallen on hard times. Lily hesitated. Something about the man tugged at her heart. He seemed alone, just like her. Without thinking, she walked toward him, her small steps hesitant but determined. When she reached him, she held out her last rose. "Mister," she said softly, her voice still trembling, "you look sad." The man blinked, startled by this sudden voice. He looked down at the little girl standing before him, her big, sorrowful eyes staring right into his. "This is for you," she continued, holding the rose up higher. "It's not much, but maybe it'll make you feel better." For a moment, he just stared at the flower in her hand. He hadn't expected kindness, especially from a child. He cleared his throat, unsure of what to say. "Why would you give this to me?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. Lily shrugged, her fingers still wrapped around the delicate stem. "Because you look like you need it more than my mama today." The man felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in a long time, warmth. No one had shown him kindness in years, not since his own world fell apart. His eyes stung, but he quickly blinked away the tears. With a shaky hand, he reached out and took the rose. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. A small smile appeared on Lily's face. "Mama always said even a little kindness can change a person's whole day." The man looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to say something more, to explain why her simple gesture meant more than she could ever know. But before he could, Lily turned and started walking away. He watched her small figure disappear down the path, the echoes of her soft footsteps fading into the distance. He looked down at the rose in his hand, his fingers tightening around the fragile stem. It was just a flower, yet it felt like something much more. What Lily didn't know was that this one act of kindness would set off a chain of events neither of them could have imagined. What happened next would change everything, both for her and for the stranger she had just met. The man sat on the bench long after Lily had disappeared from sight, still holding the delicate rose in his hand. He turned it between his fingers, feeling the soft petals, inhaling its faint but sweet scent. It had been years since anyone had given him something, years since he had felt the warmth of another person's kindness. His name was Daniel. Once he had a good life, a family, a home. But life had a way of unraveling everything in the blink of an eye. It started with a single setback, losing his job. At first, he believed he could fix things, that he would find work again soon. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, his savings disappeared. Bills piled up, and one by one, everything was taken from him. His home, his car, his dignity. The people he thought would stand by him slowly faded away, leaving him to struggle alone. Eventually, he found himself on the streets, surviving day by day, unnoticed by the world. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He had stopped believing in miracles long ago. But something about that little girl's kindness unsettled him. Why had she chosen him? What had she seen in him that made her stop? The thought lingered in his mind as he stood up and tucked the rose carefully into his coat pocket. Meanwhile, Lily walked home with slow, dragging steps. The tiny apartment she shared with her grandmother wasn't far, but the weight in her chest made every step feel heavy. She wished she could have stayed at the cemetery longer. Being near her mother's grave, even in silence, made her feel less alone. Her grandmother, Margaret, was waiting at the door when she arrived. The old woman had a kind face, lined with deep wrinkles from years of hardship. She looked down at Lily's empty hands and frowned. "You didn't bring a flower home today?" Margaret asked gently. Lily shook her head, slipping off her worn shoes. "I gave it to someone else," she admitted. Margaret raised an eyebrow, but didn't scold her. "And why did you do that, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, then shrugged. He looked sad. "I thought maybe it would help." Margaret sighed softly, kneeling down to brush a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Your mama would be proud of you," she said. She always believed kindness could change the world. Lily smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. She just nodded and went inside, her heart still full of the strange feeling she had after giving the rose away. But that simple act of kindness had already set something in motion. The next morning, Daniel found himself walking past a small bakery, his stomach aching from hunger. He had spent the night on an old park bench, his coat barely enough to keep out the cold. The delicious scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, making his stomach growl even louder. He was about to walk away when he heard a familiar voice. "Mister." He turned and saw Lily standing in front of the bakery, holding a small paper bag in her hands. She beamed up at him as she ran over and held it out. "I got you something." Daniel hesitated. "You don't have to do that, kid." "But I want to," she insisted. "It's just some bread. I bought extra today." He looked at the bag, then at her hopeful face. For a long moment, he didn't move. But then slowly, he reached out and took it. The warmth of the bread seeped into his cold hands, and something inside him cracked just a little. "Thank you," he murmured. Lily grinned. "See you later, mister," she called as she turned and skipped away. Daniel stood there, staring at the bag in his hands. It wasn't just about the bread. It was about something he had forgotten, what it felt like to be seen, to be cared for. Days passed, and each morning, Lily found Daniel near the bakery. She always had something small for him, a piece of fruit, a sandwich, sometimes just a friendly conversation. And little by little, something in Daniel started to change. He started looking forward to their talks, started feeling a flicker of hope he thought was long gone. But not everyone saw things the way Lily did. One afternoon, as she sat on the steps outside her apartment building, she overheard two neighbors whispering. "That man she's been talking to, he's homeless," one woman muttered. "She shouldn't be around people like that." "Margaret should know better," another voice replied. "What if he's dangerous?" Lily's heart pounded. She didn't understand. Daniel wasn't dangerous. He was kind. He always listened to her stories and thanked her for everything she brought him. Why did they think he was bad just because he had nowhere to go? That night, she sat at the table, staring at her untouched dinner. Finally, she looked up at her grandmother. "Grandma, Do you think people are bad just because they're poor? Margaret sighed, setting down her fork. No, sweetheart, she said gently. But the world isn't always fair. Sometimes people judge others without knowing their story. Lily frowned. But that's not right. No, it's not, Margaret agreed. But the only way to change people's minds is to show them they're wrong. Lily thought about that for a long time. She wasn't sure how to change people's minds, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop being Daniel's friend just because others didn't understand. But then something happened that neither of them saw coming. One evening, as Daniel was making his way toward the park, he spotted something unusual near a store entrance. A small crowd gathering around a van who had collapsed on the sidewalk. Without thinking, he rushed forward. People stood back, hesitant to help. Daniel knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. He recognized the symptoms: weak breathing, pale skin. It was a diabetic attack. He had seen it before. "We need to call an ambulance," Daniel said urgently, but no one moved. Some people just stared uncertain. So he acted. He pulled off his coat and tucked it under the man's head. Then he turned to a store worker standing nearby. "Does anyone here have sugar or juice?" he asked. The worker ran inside and came back with a small carton of orange juice. Daniel quickly lifted the unconscious man's head and carefully poured a little into his mouth. Moments passed, tense and silent. Then slowly, the man's eyes fluttered open. A murmur spread through the crowd. A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics took over, checking the man's vitals. One of them turned to Daniel. "You might have just saved his life," he said. Daniel nodded, stepping back, suddenly feeling self-conscious. The crowd began to disperse, but a few people lingered, whispering. Some of them were the same neighbors who had spoken about him before. And among them was Lily. She had seen everything. Her heart swelled with pride. She wanted to run to him, to tell him he had proved them all wrong. But before she could, Daniel turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Lily watched him go, her mind racing. He had saved someone's life. He was a good person. And now she knew she had to do something to make sure the rest of the world saw it too. What she didn't know was that things were about to take a turn neither of them could have expected. Lily couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. Daniel had saved someone's life, yet he had walked away as if it meant nothing. As if he still believed he was invisible. But she had seen him, really seen him, and she wanted the world to see him too. That night, as she sat on the couch, she turned to her grandmother. "Grandma, what if people knew what Daniel did? What if they saw he's not just some man on the streets, but someone who helped?" Margaret looked at her thoughtfully. "What do you have in mind?" Lily hesitated for a moment, then picked up her mother's old phone. It barely worked, but it could still record videos. "If I tell people his story, maybe they'll see him differently." The next morning, she went looking for Daniel, finding him sitting on the same bench where she had first given him the rose. He seemed surprised to see her. "I need to tell you something," she said, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. "What's that?" Lily held up the phone. "I want people to know what you did. You saved someone's life. I think if people knew, they wouldn't ignore you anymore." Daniel looked away, shaking his head. "I don't need anyone's pity." "It's not pity," Lily insisted. "It's the truth. You're not just some homeless man to ignore. You're a person who helped when no one else did." Daniel sighed. "And what if they don't care?" Lily smiled softly. "Then at least we tried." He hesitated, then gave a small nod. Lily recorded a short video, telling the story of how Daniel had saved the man outside the store. She spoke from the heart, explaining how people often judged others without knowing their stories. She ended it simply, "I gave him a rose because I thought he needed kindness. But the truth is, he's the one who gave it back." With her grandmother's help, she posted the video online. She didn't expect much, maybe a few kind comments, maybe nothing at all. But by the next morning, everything had changed. The video had gone viral. People started sharing it, leaving messages of support. Strangers offered food, clothes, and even job opportunities for Daniel. Reporters reached out, wanting to hear more. And for the first time in years, Daniel wasn't invisible. One morning, as he sat on his usual bench, a man in a suit approached him. "Are you Daniel?" the man asked. Daniel nodded cautiously. "I saw the video," the man continued. "I run a community center that helps people get back on their feet. If you're interested, we'd like to help you." Daniel was speechless. He had spent so long believing no one cared, yet here was someone offering him a second chance. He looked at Lily, who stood nearby, her eyes shining with hope. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost: hope. A few weeks later, Daniel started working at the community center, helping others who had struggled like he once did. He had a place to stay, food to eat, and a purpose again. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he spotted Lily sitting on a bench, holding a rose. He smiled and sat beside her. "Is that for me?" he asked. Lily grinned. "Nope, this one's for Mama. But I got you something else." She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a note in her handwriting. "You were never invisible to me." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked at Lily, then at the rose in her hand. "You know," he said, his voice warm, "I think your mama would be proud of you." Lily smiled, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. The world had changed, not because of something big, but because of one small act of kindness. And sometimes that was all it took.